Hello and welcome to this latest podcast in the series The Law, the Facts and Life Back on Track. I'm Julie Marsh, a partner in the medical negligence team at Boys Turner Solicitors. I act on behalf of severely injured people who have suffered their injury as a result of medical negligence. As part of assessing the extent of the injury and the impact this is likely to have on their lives, it is often necessary to consider the injured person's current accommodation and what adaptations they might need to help them maintain their independence and quality of life, despite their life-changing injury. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Jonathan France to the podcast to talk about issues with accommodation claims in cases specifically involving people who have suffered an amputation. Welcome, Jonathan, and thank you for joining me.
No, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
It'd be great to hear a bit more about you, Jonathan, your training and background, and how you came to expert witness work.
Background-wise is obviously in architecture. I started quite a number of years ago, but my family is steeped in construction. So I've always had a house extension or been living in a renovation as I've been growing up. And I have quite a number of family members who are in the construction trade. So construction is something that I've always lived and breathed. Architecture was something I got into mainly because I was advised not to go on the tools. I'm not sure if that was because I was a danger to myself or whether they felt sorry for me for not having to go through English winters. But yeah, I got into architecture quite a number of years ago. I started at age 16 and a half, 17, just about 17. And I went through my educational process through a day release program. So more of a traditional apprenticeship.
Right.
I did a foundation degree that way in the construction and architectural drawing sector. And that's how I got into the industry. But in terms of specifically getting into this industry, it came about as a result of doing quite a few disability facilities grants, or DFGs as we know them.
Yeah.
And I started that in, I think it was 2008. And it was around that time that we used to, or I used to go and measure properties for these grants. And just as a bit of background, these grants are provided by local authority, the capped typically, or they used to be then, around £30,000. And back then you could actually build an extension for that money as well. These days,
not so much.
It barely covers sort of internal adaptations, really. There is some changes actually recently about that some local authorities will give discretionary loans, which are interest free on top of it. But that then has to get paid back if the property is ever sold. And there's no, from what I've read, there's no time lapse on that. But anyway, cut long story short, on one of those projects, I actually met a deputy. And then from there on started working on the treating side of adaptations. So my sort of involvement or introduction into expert witness was actually quite a few years later. And it's actually all on the back of working on the ground, working on projects, building projects and helping individuals get back into an adapted property or helping them find a property and adapting it.
Well, that's really interesting. Not perhaps your typical route into expert witness work. So yeah, great to hear about that. So we're talking today about cases involving amputation and specifically accommodation expert reports in that scenario. What are the key issues that you look at when you're acting as an expert in a claim involving an amputation, first in respect of the current property and then looking to the future?
I suppose it comes down to the claimant's circumstances, because that feeds in massively in terms of how good an amputee they are. When I mean that, I mean from a day-to-day life perspective. So most amputees will have access, if we're talking about low amputees certainly, will have access to prosthetic limbs. The most common issue I find, certainly when it's quite early in the case, is that the prosthetic limb that they've been provided with isn't suitable for one reason or another. Maybe that's because they require additional surgery. Maybe it's because the standard NHS ones are simply too heavy. There might be lots of reasons. It also depends on the individual's age. If they're quite a fit, young and healthy individual, it might be that they can adapt more quickly to that environment of having to rely on a prosthetic limb. So their needs might be different in the short term to, say, an older person or a person who is more infirm and more finds it more challenging to negotiate around the accommodation. But the common theme with all amputees is that at some point they are likely not to have access to their prosthetic limb. So from an accommodation perspective, the worst case scenario, which is what I would normally consider, is that at some point they will use a wheelchair, even if it's, on an intermittent basis.
Yeah, certainly.
That's kind of we take the worst case scenario, and of course, we're considering lifelong needs, aren't we?
Yes, certainly, our experts would tend to be saying that during periods of illness or fatigue or issues with prosthetics like rubbing or adjustment that's needed, there's bound to be periods of time when individuals have to be off their prosthetics. And that generally with a lower limb amputee means that you're going to be using a wheelchair, which obviously means accessing a two-story property can become challenging. Although
that's right. Yeah. And I did actually have this question recently. I was on a different conference and an expert asked the question, which was quite embarrassing actually when he stood on the platform. I sort of asked the question, why is it that claimant accommodation experts always recommend a wheelchair suitable house when the amputee is a young and fit and healthy individual? This came from a medical expert. And the reason is purely that yes, it might be the case that they can manage for now, and maybe they actually manage perfectly well, but it's for exactly the same reasons that you just said, that at some point they might not have it might not be suitable for them. And the other thing is their circumstances. If we're talking about a young, fit adult, if they choose to have children, is it realistic that they can be running up the stairs to get their 2 or 3 year old who's run away? And it's things like that, just trying to think about the various scenarios that individual may face at some point in the future, and then trying to put yourself in their shoes.
Absolutely. And so when we're looking at future accommodation, it is very much the case that the normal recommendation to kind of future-proof accommodation is to access a single-story property, so that for those periods of time when somebody might not be able to access prosthetics, they can still access the entirety of their property, live independently and manage, rather than having to compromise.
Exactly. Yeah.
So when you produce these reports, obviously you produce them for the legal teams, but they make their way to the claimant. How do clients tend to react to your assessments and reports? What kind of questions do they have? Or do you get kind of pushback to recommendations that you make when you're out seeing claimants?
The reaction, I suppose, I don't really see the reaction firstly for quite some time. The only indication I've got in terms of whether a claimant or how a claimant has reacted is based on feedback from maybe someone from like yourself, Julie, in terms of whether they're happy or not about it. During my assessments, when I meet the claimant, I always make it very clear that the recommendations I made in the report are based on my recommendations, based on the evidence, and that ultimately it'll be up to them to decide how, what type of property they choose. So, for example, I include property examples in my report. That's the basis that I form my opinion on the likely costs of a property to purchase. But ultimately, which property they choose to purchase, certainly if they've got capacity, they'll be able to express an opinion on that. So I've always found that that's helped to kind of allay their fears, because I think sometimes claimants feel that they're being told what to do every step of the way. And that's not necessarily the case. My role is to advise the court what this person needs on account of injury. But ultimately, they will have a decision to make as to how they want to implement that in their life.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. Certainly when we bring our clients together with experts to look at reports around future need, we are often faced with well, I just don't think I'm going to do that, or I'm not going to move that, or I'm not going to need that, or I'm not going to want it, which is always just a view taken as a snapshot in time. And it can be very, very difficult for injured people who have been waiting a long time to receive significant compensation, which can be life-changing, and have had to cope in the interim to think about the future to that degree. But certainly it's our job to remind them that post-settlement with compensation, they have the freedom to do what's best for them at that point in time. And that might be, in some respects, adopting your recommendations, but often given the passage of time, properties that you might have recommended as suitable in an area will have been sold or no longer available. And so it's back to the drawing board, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the most common things that I see, certainly amongst amputees, are individuals that choose to buy a 2-story house in the short term because they want that sense of normality of them sleeping upstairs with their children, for example, and maybe they don't have children yet, or they want to have a family. I have seen that, but I've also seen individuals who were very clear that that's what they wanted at the start, but then over time, passage of time, they kind of changed their mind. For one reason or another. Maybe it was the lift breaking down, I don't know, but there's no reason as to why.
Yeah, so sometimes I think input from other experts. So one of my amputee clients said to me at the conclusion of the claim that they had never learnt really so much about what their injury might mean and what the future might hold, with the caveat that nobody really knows what's going to happen. But all these possibilities and theories were really information that they didn't have at their fingertips and only learnt as a result of expert input during the claim.
Yeah.
And I agree, I've got a young female client who suffered a mid-foot amputation of both feet, and she was very clear that in her mid-20s, the last thing she wanted to do was buy a bungalow.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, she was not happy with that. But she has bought a 2-story property. She has renovated it, and she's put in a lift because she is anticipating having a family and is anticipating that there are going to be times when she isn't going to be mobile on her prosthesis or even without her prosthesis. Interestingly, she's someone who was very keen to try to make sure that the property didn't look disabled.
Yes.
So was looking for aids and equipment that didn't scream about her disability to people that might visit the property, which I think is a consideration as well for people, especially younger.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's a huge consideration. It's not just amputees who feel that way. We've got some who are catastrophically injured, and they still have a personal opinion on how their home looks, and quite rightly so, because it's ultimately our home, and our home, what we describe as home, might not look like home to someone else, but it's ours, isn't it? And it makes it no different regardless of the person's injury.
No, completely. So we've talked about the importance of looking to the future in these cases. What other expert evidence is key for you to consider when you're looking at your assessment?
Certainly from the amputee perspective, it's the likelihood of how often they use their prosthetics, how active they're going to be, reports that are around the care side of things, if that's applicable. I know that perhaps with younger amputees, that might not be necessarily a requirement in the short term, but for their lifelong needs, it would be. It might also be a requirement in the short term from an assistance perspective if they did have children. And that's something that I do see quite a lot. So those are two quite critical reports. The other one is the occupational therapy, and the physiotherapy report is one I would look at, especially with regards to maintaining a good program of exercise and maintaining strength and things like that. So those are probably the key reports I would look at, which are more quantum related. Yeah.
And those would lead you to considering issues like additional space in the property for carers accommodation, physiotherapy room, space for equipment that might be needed.
That's right, factors. And again, it's trying to tell or paint a picture in terms of what that person might need in the future. So you're trying to, again, put yourself in their shoes, trying to imagine what issues they might be facing in the future, and trying to accommodate that with a right-sized spaced house, the right number of rooms. I think the other thing is something that I do see quite often is an individual might have a house that is of an ideal size on paper, but the rooms and where they are and the relationship between the rooms aren't ideal, and that's what makes the home not suitable, because it can be quite disjointed. So I think that is a major thing as well to consider, and is a major thing to consider when assessing a property as to whether it's suitable.
Yes, and so I was going to come on to that, so when you're first starting out and looking at your accommodation report, presumably the first thing you do is look at the current property and look at whether it can be adapted, extended, and adjustments made to meet that need, or whether it is a situation where there's just nothing that can be done.
In the ideal, it would be in everyone's interest that the current property can be adapted. I say in everyone's interest, firstly, that it would be in the claimant's interest because that's their home, it's the home they chose, it's the one that they've lived at, it's what they call. And also from a cost perspective, from a viability perspective, it's all a lot lower risk because it's all within the individual's control. So the ideal is that we can adapt the current property, but it's very rare to actually make that feasible. So in most cases, I would say 99% of cases, you walk into a property and you know already that the house isn't going to be suitable because in most cases it's too small. The average size of properties is simply much too small for a person who's got a requirement for the worst case scenario of a wheelchair user. So the likelihood is they're going to have to relocate. So part of the report, part of the assessment is to assess the current property. If that's not suitable, can they manage with some temporary adaptations? That might be something that's part of the claim. If the temporary adaptations can help to fill some needs, that might allow the claimant to remain at that property for the foreseeable time. And when we say that, I mean for the duration of the case. If it's completely unsuitable, usually at that point, I'll explore temporary rental properties as part of the claim as well. So that's something that they can move into. It will enhance their safety. It might promote greater rehabilitation. There might be lots of other factors, lots of other reasons why that rental property would be a better alternative or a safer alternative than the current home. And then, yes, that third step in the process is to purchase a property that will meet their lifelong needs.
It's interesting mentioning about the rental property, because I think it can really help, if interim funds are available, for a claimant to move into a more suitable property, to see the difference and actually live it, which can help them come to terms with and understand, I suppose, a bit more the likely future need and what it is they need to be looking for in the future.
No, absolutely. And it's all too common that you hear claimants say that I've had the following equipment recommended to me, but I can't get it because there's no room for it. And they're actually missing out on being educated on how that equipment can help them or how it can improve certain things and maybe help towards a slightly better outcome. And obviously all that's outside of my expertise, but you can see from an accommodation perspective how that can be limiting. So yes, absolutely. The rental properties are often, and in more cases than not, a very useful thing for claimants to get used to a better outcome.
And I think it showcases as well the importance of bringing all of the quantum experts together to discuss these type of issues, which we often do in conference, because sometimes recommendations can be made and they feel a little bit kind of just out there in the vacuum. But if you bring all the experts together and can bring all the arguments together, then you can see what the overall benefit can be for the claimant. And also, as you say, educating them on, well, the benefit of this equipment is that you are stronger physically, and that means you can use your prosthetics more often, and that means that you're more independently mobile, and all of those issues, which are all important as well for the purpose of the litigation case as well.
Yeah.
So you sometimes recommend bits of equipment or bits and pieces in your report. What type of thing would you normally recommend, appreciating that you defer to physiotherapy about plinths and physio equipment and OTs? There's sometimes quite a bit of an overlap, isn't there, with OT recommendations?
Yeah, so normally what you see is the OT would recommend the type of equipment required, but the cost of it and the cost of installation would be deferred to myself. So in an OT report, they would recommend what equipment is required and where it's required and how many, for example, hoisting, how many rooms would require hoisting. And then at that point, I would take the recommendations made by the occupational therapist and put forward some costs. And the costs I normally put forward, I say normally, in all cases, are based on quotations. What I'm looking at ideally from the OT is which equipment do you recommend? Because obviously in the world of equipment, there is lots of different variations and there's lots of accessories that you can get or, additions. For example, a bath can be, height adjustable bath can be £10,000, but with all the accessories, it can be £2,000 or £3,000 more. So things like that's quite important, and that's what I'm looking for from the OT. So yes, that is where there's no overlap. In terms of something that's specific to amputees, it tends to be a more of a lighter equipment list, I would say, from occupational therapists. I've seen in some cases the provision for wash-dry toilets for accessible requirements. But then because if they're a lower amputee as well, alongside other injuries, the other factor is the height of the toilet, for example. So they might go down a wall-hung toilet, which can be set at various heights. So things like that are useful to know. But in my experience, they don't always tend to affect the costs. Having experience on the treating side, that's the sort of thing that I'm trying to get from the OT to basically, get out a tape measure and tell me where does it need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important to understand how those reports dovetail and those opinions work together to try and put together that picture of what's needed.
Absolutely.
So you also are involved with some claimants post-settlement of their cases. So how do things differ once you're over that line and involved with claimants on the other side once the case has been settled?
In terms of how they differ, well, it can be quite different. And when I say quite different, I don't mean that it's the expert evidence is basically put in the bin and then that's the end of it. It's definitely not along those lines. I think there's sometimes that conflict of theory and reality, in that in theory something might work, but in practice it doesn't. And often that can come down to simply testing whatever that recommendation is, or playing it out and seeing how that works. And it might not work because of the individual's short-term circumstances. So we go back to that original conversation where I might have recommended a single level bungalow to suit that person's lifelong needs. And you've given the example of your client who's just said absolutely not, move into a 2-story house with a lift, and that's absolutely fine. But that's kind of how the differences play out between the expert role and the treating role. And of course, the major thing, which is apparent when you're helping an individual, is that you don't always see the person when reading all those reports, and getting to know the individual, getting to know their family, all the circumstances around it, probably has a greater extent and greater effect on what we do inside the property. Very simple things, nothing, elaborate, but the younger family who just want that living kitchen dining environment because it's the hub of the home, that isn't necessarily reflected inside an accommodation report, or the proximity between the specialist bedroom for the claimant and the relationship with the carer's annex, so that the carers are not walking past other family members' bedrooms. Things like that don't necessarily get played out or are made as clear in an expert report. So yes, it is very different, and it's very time consuming on the treating side, but it's very rewarding as well.
Yeah, I suppose it's great to get to a point where you see that all of that work that happened as part of the litigation case comes to fruition, and you can see what a difference it makes. Well, it's been great to talk to you today, Jonathan. Thank you very much for joining me to discuss such an interesting topic. It's been great to have your input and your opinion on these issues. I do hope that you've enjoyed listening to this podcast. If you or anyone you know has experienced an injury as a result of poor medical care, or wants to inquire about making a complaint or bringing a claim, our contact details can be found on our website, boysturnerclaims.com. And do remember to like, follow, or subscribe to the podcast.